So imagine holding a 3,000-year-old property deed.
Right, which sounds incredibly dry.
Oh, totally. At first glance, it is impossibly boring. It's just this dusty list of rocks, trees, and hills.
Yeah, just ancient zoning documents.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you look closer and you realize this, mundane document actually contains the blueprints for a royal spy ring.
And hidden desert oases.
Yes, and honestly, the seeds of a complete cultural collapse. So, welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Before we jump in, I just want to offer a divine blessing for your day and the entire week ahead to everyone listening.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, and part of that blessing for you today is the profound clarity we're about to find in what seems like an incredibly mundane ancient text, which is Joshua chapter 16.
It really is like a masterclass in why we should never just skim an ancient text.
Right.
Because when you stop treating it like a dead document and, start treating it like a window into a living, breathing civilization, it completely changes the narrative.
It really does. And to help us look through that window today for you, we are anchoring our discussion on the historical and linguistic research from the study notes of two major sources, the Holman Study Bible and the NWA Study Bible.
Both are fantastic resources.
Yeah, they are highly regarded for digging into the physical realities and the linguistic nuances of ancient Hebrew texts. So they take the raw data of Joshua 16, which is essentially just a boundary description for the land inheritance of the tribe of Ephraim, and they reconstruct the world behind it.
Right, and we have to remember, Ephraim isn't just some random name.
No, not at all.
This is one of the premier tribes of Israel, descended directly from Joseph. So when they are being allotted their territory in the Promised Land, the stakes are incredibly high.
Life or death, basically.
Exactly. The borders drawn in this chapter are going to define their geopolitical reality, their economy, and really their physical survival for centuries.
So let's actually map this out. Let's look at the physical terrain the scholars highlight here, because, well, it is sprawling.
It's massive.
Yeah. So if you picture this ancient border, it starts way out east at the Jordan River, right near the famous city of Jericho.
Right.
From there, it stretches up through this intense, rugged wilderness, climbing into the hill country all the way up to Bethel.
Which is quite a hike.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
And then it just keeps pushing westward, rolling down through the foothills until it eventually hits the Mediterranean Sea. So we are talking about a massive, wildly diverse slice of real estate.
It's basically a geographical gauntlet.
Yeah.
You have the deep, arid depression of the Jordan Valley, then the steep, rocky ascent into the Central Highlands, and finally the coastal plains.
Right.
And the historical research zeroes in on how meticulously the ancients mapped this out. Like, right at the start of that eastern borderline near Jericho, the text doesn't just broadly gesture at the landscape.
No, it's very specific.
Exactly. It explicitly names a landmark called the Waters of Jericho.
Which, sounds very poetic, like a metaphor or something, like the sands of time.
That's the modern assumption, sure. But the research points out that this was a hyper-specific strategic location.
Because of the water.
Right. In an arid climate, water is the ultimate currency. This wasn't just a generic reference to the Jordan River. It specifically identifies a major life-sustaining spring.
Wow.
And the phenomenal thing is, scholars have identified it as a spring that is still known today as Ain es-Sultan.
Okay, I have to admit, that just blows my mind.
It's incredible, right?
It is. Because reading this text feels like finding an old, crumpled pirate's treasure map.
Yeah, exactly.
You're reading along, looking at all these obscure, faded instructions like turn left at the Skull Rocks, walk 50 paces, and then you realize with a shock that one of those obscure landmarks is a real physical place.
That you can go to today.
Yes. You can pull it up on Google Earth right now. Ain es-Sultan is still flowing. You can literally go touch the water that marked the ancient property line of Ephraim.
It completely grounds the text in reality, I think.
Absolutely.
It forces us to remember that we aren't reading mythology here. These were real ancient people trying to establish a defensible perimeter for their families, their flocks, and, their future.
Right. Marking that spring wasn't poetry. It was national security.
Exactly. And agricultural survival.
But knowing the physical rocks and springs of this border isn't enough, right? Because borders aren't just lines drawn in the sand.
No, they're friction points.
Right. They are friction points between populations. And that brings us to the actual people living along these borders. Because while that spring survived the test of time perfectly, the neighbors, well, they represent a massive historical mystery.
They really do. As the border description moves westward, the text lists some extremely obscure people groups that Ephraim bumped up against. Specifically, the historical notes draw our attention to the Archites and the Japhletites.
Okay, and who exactly are the Japhletites and the Archites? Because I consider myself pretty well read on ancient history, and I draw an absolute blank on these two.
Well, you draw a blank because they are essentially historical ghosts.
Really?
Yeah. The scholarly consensus on both the Archites and the Japhletites is that they are almost entirely a mystery to modern historians.
Wow.
They are virtually unknown outside of these specific boundary descriptions in the book of Joshua. They were neighbors, their territory literally defined the edge of Ephraim's world, and then they seemingly just vanished into the sands of time.
Wait, how does a whole society just vanish? Are they just a footnote on a property deed now?
Mostly yes. But this is where the linguistic research provides a brilliant insight specifically regarding the Archites.
Okay, I love this part.
It highlights why reading ancient texts in their original languages, or at least, having scholars who do, is so crucial.
Right, because initially, I know some readers might think, wait a second, I've seen the name Archite somewhere else in ancient texts.
Exactly.
There's an Archite mentioned back in the genealogies of Genesis, and then again in 1 Chronicles.
Right, so it's a very common assumption to connect them, but the linguistic analysis completely severs that connection based on a single phonetic detail.
One letter, right.
Okay. Just one letter. The Archites mentioned in Genesis and Chronicles are spelled with the Hebrew letter kaf, which produces a standard K sound.
Okay.
But the Archites, living here on the border of Ephraim in Joshua 16, their name is spelled with a quaf, which is a much deeper guttural sound formed further back in the throat.
So, just for you, the listener, to visualize this, it's basically the ancient equivalent of spelling a name with a hard C versus a K. But in ancient Hebrew, that single phonetic shift represents an entirely separate lineage.
Yes.
It means we're looking at two totally different groups of people.
Precisely. That level of meticulous record-keeping prevents us from conflating two distinct populations across hundreds of years of history.
Right.
And what makes this obscure, quaff-spelled Archite tribe so fascinating is that they didn't entirely vanish.
No, they didn't.
Before they faded from the historical record, this tiny border tribe produced one of the most famous covert operatives in the ancient world.
Yes. This is easily the most thrilling historical connection in the research. This obscure tribe produced a man named Hushai. And for anyone who doesn't know the background, Hushai was a very close friend and advisor to King David centuries later.
And he became crucial during the darkest moment of David's reign.
Exactly. To give you the context, David's own son, Absalom, launched a massive, highly successful coup to steal the throne.
It was a catastrophic betrayal.
It really was. David had to flee the capital city, weeping, completely desperate and on the run. He needed a mole on the inside to survive.
And that mole was Hushai the Archite.
Right. Hushai pretended to defect to Absalom's side, but he was actually a deep-cover spy for David, feeding Absalom terrible military advice to stall the rebellion until David could regroup.
I mean, it completely reframes how we view this dry boundary list.
It really does.
This supposedly boring border town wasn't just empty space. It was the breeding ground for a man who would eventually save the entire monarchy through high-stakes espionage.
Yeah.
The geographical lines drawn here set the stage for the political thrillers of later centuries.
It's incredible. But, the border drawing in Joshua 16 doesn't just deal with external neighbors and future spies.
No, there's internal drama, too.
Yeah, it details a very messy, deeply confusing internal real estate situation between the tribes of Israel themselves. We see this specifically in verse 9, and I have to admit, this part threw me for a loop.
Oh, you're talking about the enclaves.
Right. Verse 9 reveals that Ephraim was given cities and surrounding villages that were physically located entirely inside the territory belonging to their brother tribe, Manasseh.
Yeah, it's very odd.
If they're going through all the trouble to draw these highly precise, defensible lines, why suddenly throw their hands up and blend the territories together?
It absolutely defies our modern concept of a clean, hard border.
It does. Think about it like buying a massive 500-acre ranch. You get the deed, you move in, but the legal paperwork dictates that your brother legally owns 3 of the best fishing ponds and 2 cabins right smack in the middle of your property.
Yeah, that would be a nightmare.
You'd have to share access roads, water rights, grazing paths. It's an administrative nightmare waiting to happen. So what is the mechanism here? Why would an agrarian society deliberately entangle their lands like this?
Well, the scholars suggest this blending of borders is highly intentional, and it really comes down to a mix of population dynamics and familial bonds.
Okay.
Remember, Ephraim and Manasseh are both descendants of Joseph. They share a unique fraternal bond that sets them apart from the other tribes.
So it's a physical map representing a familial reality.
Partially, yes. But practically speaking, it's also about managing resources.
Because they're farmers.
Exactly. In a purely agrarian society, survival depends entirely on arable land and water access.
Right.
If Ephraim's population was exploding, or if the specific terrain they were allotted couldn't fully sustain their agricultural needs, strict adherence to a clean line on a map would mean starvation. So they bleed over into Manasseh's territory. They didn't have the luxury of building giant walls and ignoring each other. Their lives, their agriculture, and their administration had to be deeply enmeshed for mutual survival.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The enclaves force integration. They couldn't isolate from each other even if they wanted to.
Exactly.
But, and here is where the deep dive takes a massive turn, because while Ephraim's overlapping borders with Manasseh were a sign of brotherly integration, Ephraim was simultaneously making a much more dangerous, highly compromising integration with an enemy.
Right. And this brings us to the twist ending of the chapter in verse 10. We have to talk about the city of Gezer.
This is the climax. God has given Ephraim this massive, meticulously drawn territory. They have the springs of Jericho, the highlands, the coastal access.
They have everything they need.
Everything. But despite this monumental gift, verse 10 casually mentions that the Ephraimites completely failed to drive out the Canaanites living in the city of Gezer.
And it's not just that they fail and retreat. The text specifies exactly what they do instead.
Right. Instead of driving them out, they let the Canaanites stay, but they subject them to forced labor. The specific Hebrew word used in the text is mass.
And both the Holman and NAA study notes flag this as a critical turning point moment in the text.
It's huge.
This isn't just a minor historical detail. It has massive socioeconomic and theological implications. Let's look at the economic side first.
Yeah, break down this concept of mass for us, because it sounds like they just made a pragmatic decision to get some free labor.
It looks pragmatic on the surface, sure, but the historical research reveals that mass, this specific system of forced labor, was actually a Canaanite city-state invention.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it was an oppressive, deeply entrenched economic system used by the Canaanite kings long before Israel ever arrived on the scene.
So Israel didn't invent this labor system?
Not at all. They appropriated it.
Wow.
They looked at a brutal Canaanite system of economic oppression and said, hey, we like the margins on this. We'll adopt your system and we'll turn it back on you.
That is so dark.
It is. And the scholars point out a chilling historical foreshadowing here. This exact same Canaanite system of mass is what King Solomon would later use centuries down the road to build his massive empire.
Which ultimately led to the fracturing of the entire nation?
Exactly.
So they are absorbing the economic culture of the very people they were supposed to be displacing. But wait, I have a major problem with this on a structural level.
What's that?
If we look at the dominant theology of the entire book of Joshua, the core conviction is divine victory.
Right.
The promise is that God guarantees the land and hands over the enemies. How does the text logically justify Ephraim just failing? Doesn't this break the theological rules of the book?
You've just hit on the exact theological tension that the scholars highlight. This is a profound dilemma of the text.
Yeah.
The INDA notes point out a highly disconcerting pattern happening here. Back in chapter 15, the massive tribe of Judah fails to expel the Jebusites in Jerusalem.
Right, I remember that.
Later in chapter 17, Manasseh struggles to clear their valleys. And right here in chapter 16, Ephraim fails at Gezer. It's a pattern.
It is. The theological question the scholars pose is blunt. Is the God of the Canaanites stronger than the God of Israel? Which, obviously, the author of Joshua would scream no at.
Absolutely. But the physical reality on the ground contradicts their theology. The notes remind us that Moses had repeatedly, explicitly warned Israel against letting the Canaanites live among them.
It was rule number 1.
It wasn't a suggestion. It was the prime directive. To leave them in the land was to invite cultural and religious ruin.
So why did they do it? What was the mechanism of this failure?
The notes mention Ephraim's excuse, which the text elaborates on a bit later. The Ephraimites claim they couldn't drive them out because the Canaanites in the lowlands had iron chariots.
Okay, let's talk about the iron chariots, because this is where the practical meets the theological.
Right.
Iron chariots in the ancient Near East were the absolute peak of military technology.
They were devastating.
If you are a Bronze Age infantry force coming out of the hills And you have to face iron-plated chariots on flat coastal terrain. I mean, that is the ancient equivalent of sending foot soldiers armed with rifles out to fight a line of modern tanks. It is terrifying.
It is tactically terrifying, yes. From a purely military perspective, the fear is entirely justified.
Sure.
But from a theological perspective, it's a catastrophic failure of faith.
Ah, right.
The entire premise of their journey out of Egypt was that divine power supersedes military technology. But they look at the iron chariots, they do the tactical math, and they flinch.
They flinch, and then they rationalize it with economics.
Exactly.
I was trying to think of how to explain this compromise to you, the listener, in a modern context. It's exactly like a brilliant tech startup.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. Imagine a startup founded with a revolutionary, world-changing mission. But building that technology requires years of grueling, unprofitable, incredibly difficult engineering work.
It's a grind.
Yeah. It requires fighting the iron chariots of the industry. Instead of doing the hard work to realize their ultimate vision, they get intimidated by the market. So they take their early, half-finished tech and they just license it to a massive, corrupt corporation for a quick payout.
They trade the ultimate mission for quarterly profits.
Exactly. They looked at the iron chariots, they got scared, they completely forgot the divine promise that guaranteed their victory, and they settled for making the Canaanites pay them a little bit of tribute instead.
Yeah.
They chose convenience over the covenant.
And here is where we have to understand the mechanism of that cultural erosion Moses warned about. How exactly does adopting mass, this forced labor, destroy them?
Right. How does it play out?
Think about the logistics of enslaving and taxing a population. You can't just put them in a corner and ignore them. You have to interact with them every single day.
Right. You have to manage them.
Exactly. To manage them, you have to learn their language.
Yeah.
To tax their agriculture, you have to integrate their accounting and their seasonal calendars. To work alongside them, your children start playing with their children. And eventually you start absorbing their culture, their worldview, and most dangerously, their gods.
Wow.
The very mechanism of control forced labor actually bound Israel to the culture they were supposed to remove. They thought they were dominating the Canaanites, but in reality, they were slowly being assimilated by them.
They domesticated the threat instead of eliminating it.
Perfectly said.
So let's step back and look at the whole picture of what we've unpacked today. Because this really has been an incredible journey from geography to theology.
We started with physical dirt and ended with spiritual compromise.
We started with what looked like a deeply boring list of borders and ancient springs, and realized there were vital lifelines, like Aina Sultan, that you can still see today.
Yeah.
We moved through the linguistic mysteries of lost tribes, discovering how a single guttural Hebrew letter separated a forgotten ghost town from Hushai, the legendary royal spy who saved King David's throne.
A fantastic twist.
And then we looked at the strange, overlapping real estate of brothers who had to blend their borders to survive an agrarian landscape.
And we ended up at a profound theological crisis. A crisis about human compromise in the face of immense military intimidation and divine promises.
We saw Ephraim look at the iron chariots, get completely intimidated, and choose the economic payout of forced labor over the hard, frightening work of total obedience.
Which leaves us with a highly relevant, provocative thought to consider as we wrap up.
I'm ready for it. What should we take away from this ancient failure?
Well, when we look at the warnings from Moses in the source text, Ephraim decided to keep the Canaanites around for the economic benefit of that forced labor.
Yeah.
They thought they were the ones in control. They thought, we can handle this. We are the masters here. We're benefiting from this arrangement.
They thought they had neutralized the threat by monetizing it.
Precisely. But the question we have to ponder in our own lives is this. What are our iron chariots? What are the hard battles we are avoiding?
Oof, that's a big question.
Because how often do the small, convenient compromises we make today, the bad habits, the toxic relationships, or the ethical shortcuts that we fail to drive out because they seem beneficial in the moment, or because fighting them seems too difficult, how often do those exact convenient compromises become the very things that end up assimilating and enslaving our future?
Wow. That is a phenomenal, heavy question. We think we're putting our problems to work for us, but we're really just inviting them to live in our house.
Yeah.
And eventually, they take over. Thank you for walking through that ancient map with me and uncovering all the profound layers hiding in those scholarly study notes.
It was a privilege to explore it with you. The ancient world always has something to teach us if we're willing to look closely.
And to everyone joining us, thank you for coming along on this deep dive into Joshua 16. God blesses all of you listening. Until next time.